Chapter 16. The Death of the Wisest Persian. Vahid, who had been sent by the king as his personal representative to investigate the truth of the Bab's mission, was the next to fall in this nationwide wave of persecutions. In the early days of the siege at Fort Sheikh Tabarsi, Vahid had hurried to Tehran to make the necessary preparations for joining Mullah Hussein and Qudus inside the fort. He was about to leave Tehran when he learned that it was too late, that his friends had already been captured or slain. During this visit to Tehran, Vahid met a companion who wrote down his recollections of that meeting. I observed in Vahid's august countenance the signs of a glory and power which I had not noticed during my first journey with him to the capital, nor on other occasions of meeting, and I knew that these signs portended the near approach of his departure from this world. Subsequently he said several times in the course of conversation, "This is my last journey, and hereafter you will see me no more." Sometimes when we were together and the conversation took an appropriate turn, he would remark, "I swear by that loved one in the grasp of whose power my soul lies, that I know and could tell where and how I shall be slain, and who it is that shall slay me, and how glorious and blessed a thing it is that my blood should be shed for the uplifting of the word of truth." After this last visit to Tehran, Vahid journeyed to Tahir's native town of Qazvin, and from there went to Qum, Kashan, Esfahan, Adistan, and Adikan. In each of these cities he met his fellow believers and was able to stimulate their enthusiasm and reinforce their efforts. In every city he would explain the fundamental teachings of the Bab with zest and fearlessness. He succeeded in winning a considerable number of the most able and notable citizens to his cause. Thus Vahid became an important target for the Prime Minister and all other enemies of the Bab. The story of Vahid's investigation of the Bab, undertaken on behalf of the former king and Prime Minister, was well known to the people. That these two had agreed to abide by Vahid's findings was also well known, as was the fact that they had broken their pledge when they had heard that Vahid had become a follower of the Bab. Vahid was a man of great influence, a man of wealth and fame. In addition to his beautiful house in Yazd, where his wife and 4 sons lived, he also had a home in Darab, and still another in Nairis. These homes were noted for their elegance and their superb furnishings. Vahid visited his home in the city of Yazd, in the heart of Persia, on the feast of the New Year. It coincided with the anniversary of the Bab's declaration of his mission. The most important religious leaders and notables came out to meet him. The Nawab Iradavi, who was the most bitter of Vahid's enemies, was also present. He resented the splendor of Vahid's reception and hinted maliciously that it was not really the national festival of the New Year that Vahid was celebrating. "The Shah's imperial banquet," he said, "can scarcely hope to rival the sumptuous repast you have spread before us. I suspect that in addition to this national festival, which today we are celebrating, you commemorate another one besides it." Vahid made a bold and sarcastic retort that made those who were present laugh. They all applauded his stinging rebuke because they were aware of the Nawab's stinginess and wickedness. This ridicule enraged the Nawab. He promised himself that if it lay in his power, Vahid would die violently because of it. Vahid took this occasion to proclaim without reservation the principles of the Bab's faith. Some people were irresistibly attracted. Others, unable to challenge successfully the defense that Vahid made for his new faith, denounced it inwardly, swearing to do whatever they could to extinguish it. They joined forces with the Nawab and made plans to overthrow Vahid without delay. Nicholas, in his history of those days, writes, "To love and to conceal one's secret is impossible. says the poet. So Vahid began to preach openly in the mosques, in the streets, in the bazaars, on the public squares, in a word, wherever he could find listeners. Such an enthusiasm brought forth fruit, and the conversations were numerous and sincere. The mullahs, deeply troubled, violently denounced the sacrilege to the governor of the city. The priests were agreed on one vital point: Vahid must be destroyed. They spread the report of that New Year's Day banquet, saying, though his listeners ranked among the most illustrious of the mujtahids, doctors of Islamic law, of the city, no one could be found in that assemblage to venture a protest against his vehement assertions of the claims of his creed. The silence kept by those who heard him has been responsible for the wave of enthusiasm which has swept over the city in his favour, and has brought no less than half of its inhabitants to his feet, while the remainder are being fast attracted. This report raced like a grass fire through the surrounding district. It engendered hatred, but at the same time it brought crowds of interested people from distant towns and villages. They flocked to Vahid's home to hear about the Bab, and a great many embraced the new religion. "What are we to do?" they asked Vahid. "In what manner do you advise us to show forth the sincerity of our faith, the intensity of our devotion?" Each day, from early morning until late at night, Vahid was absorbed in teaching them, answering their questions, and inspiring them to return home to teach in their own villages. For 40 days this feverish teaching activity continued. Vahid's home became a rallying point for both men and women. The Nawab finally convinced the governor of Yazd that if Vahid was not constrained, the city would soon revolt against the king's government, and that he, the governor, would be to blame. The governor was new, young, and inexperienced, and thus easily manipulated. The Nawab entreated him to send a force of armed men to surround Vahid's home and put an end to his teaching. The governor succumbed to the Nawab's entreaties and ordered out a detachment of soldiers. The Nawab quickly sent his personal instructions to a mob of townspeople to rush to Vahid's home and do all they could to add to his humiliation. He implied that Vahid's death would be a welcome thing in the eyes of God. Even after his house was completely surrounded by a regiment of soldiers and the infuriated mob, Vahid continued speaking to a large gathering of friends and followers in the yard below from an upper window. The people gathered below were alarmed at the sight of soldiers and the great mob of townspeople. They turned to Vahid in their distress, asking for instructions. His servant, Hassan, quickly saddled Vahid's horse and brought it to the courtyard below his window so that he might flee for safety. Vahid called upon his friends to be calm. "This very steed," Vahid said, as his eyes fell upon the horse his servant had saddled and brought for him, "the late Muhammad Shah gave me, and that with it I might undertake the mission with which he entrusted me, of conducting an impartial investigation into the nature of the faith proclaimed by the Bab. He asked me to report personally to him the results of my inquiry, inasmuch as I was the only one among the ecclesiastical leaders of Tehran in whom he could repose implicit confidence. When I came into his presence, however, and heard his words, the opposite of that which I had imagined took place. In the course of my first audience with him, I was utterly abashed and confounded. By the end of the second, I felt as helpless and ignorant as a child. The third found me as lowly as the dust beneath his feet. He had, indeed, ceased to be the contemptible Sayyid I had previously imagined. To me, he was the manifestation of God himself, the living embodiment of the divine spirit. Ever since that day, I have yearned to lay down my life for his sake. I rejoice that the day I have longed to witness is fast approaching." Vahid's friends became frightened. They feared that he was speaking of that very day and hour, for the soldiers and the mob were preparing to assault them. Seeing the agitation that had seized them, Vahid again urged them to be calm and patient. He told them to rest assured that God, the omnipotent avenger, would soon crush with defeat the forces arrayed against the faithful. Shortly after Vahid had uttered these words, the news came that a great number of friendly companions were approaching his home to save him. This rescue party flung themselves upon the attackers, crying, "O Lord of the age!" Their valour and utter fearlessness alarmed and scattered the entire detachment of soldiers, who abandoned their arms and fled for shelter. Later that night, Vahid met the leader of the rescue party, who had plans to attack and conquer the enemy. Vahid attempted to discourage him from carrying out this plan, which was not in keeping with the teachings of the Bab, and would only incite further violent clashes with the local authorities. Vahid urged his friend to leave Yazd immediately, and to leave him and the other companions in Yazd to the care and protection of God. "Not until our appointed time comes," Vahid said, "will the enemy be able to inflict upon us the slightest injury." However, the friend chose to remain and positioned himself and his band of men outside the military fort to which the soldiers had retreated, forcing those who were in and around it to seek refuge inside the fort, adding to the humiliation of their earlier defeat. Meanwhile, the Nawab was attempting to stir up enough animosity among the townspeople to motivate them to attack Vahid's house. Vahid sent a messenger through the streets of Yazd with the warning that he would not attack anyone, but that he would defend himself and his home. This warning succeeded in preventing the Nawab from finding any support among the townspeople for attacking Vahid. The Nawab now turned his attention to the group of Babis who were positioned outside the military fort. A mob rushed forth to attack them, and the soldiers in the fort began firing on them. The leader of the group of Babis was struck by a bullet and injured, and a number of his supporters were hurt. The leader's brother quickly moved him to a place of safety, then carried him, at the leader's request, to Vahid's house, with the enemy in hot pursuit. After another skirmish, in which the enemy was again routed, Vahid directed his companions to disperse to safety. He knew that the hour for his own departure from Yazd had come. He advised his wife to take the children and all of their belongings and go to her father's house for safety. He instructed her to leave all of his personal possessions behind. "This palatial residence," he told her, "I have built with the sole intention that it should be eventually demolished in the path of the cause, and the stately furnishings with which I have adorned it have been purchased in the hope that one day I shall be able to sacrifice them for the sake of my beloved." Vahid continued, saying, "Then will friend and foe alike realize that he who owned this was endowed with so great and priceless a heritage that an earthly mansion, however sumptuously adorned and magnificently equipped, had no worth in his eyes, that it had sunk in his estimation to the state of a heap of bones to which only the dogs of earth could feel attracted." He hoped that this evidence of his willingness to make material sacrifices for the sake of his beliefs would help to open others' eyes and inspire them to follow in his footsteps. Vahid said farewell to his dear wife and bade a tender goodbye to two of his sons. The other two sons would leave Yazd with him. In the middle of the night he collected the writings of the Bab that were in his possession and gave them to his servant Hassan with the order to take them and await his arrival outside the city gate. He told Hassan exactly which route to take, warning that if he were to disregard the instructions he would never be able to meet him again. Hassan mounted his horse and prepared to leave. He heard the cries of the patrolling sentinels who were keeping a night watch over the city. Afraid they might capture him and seize the manuscripts, he took what he thought to be a safer route to the gates of the city. As he was passing through one section of the town, he was recognized by the sentinels. They opened fire on him, downing his horse and capturing Hassan alive. Meanwhile, Wahid, accompanied by his 2 sons, followed the route he had told Hassan to take, and was soon safely outside the city. The moment Wahid left Yazd, his enemies, under the leadership of the Nawab, rushed to his house to plunder his possessions. They carried away all of the furnishings, then demolished the house completely. Wahid set out at once for his home in Niris. That first night he walked over 20 miles until he at last approached the village where his brother lived. Wahid did not enter his brother's house. Instead, he encamped in the recesses of a nearby mountain. His brother, hearing of his presence there, secretly sent out horses and provisions that Wahid needed for his journey to Niris. A body of the governor's mounted troops was sent from Yazd in pursuit of Wahid. They followed his trail to his brother's village, thinking they would find him there. They searched the house where they suspected he was concealed. Unable to find him, they appeased their anger and disappointment by seizing as much of his brother's property as they could carry away, then returned to Yazd. The Nawab was still not satisfied. Wahid's teaching in Yazd had stopped, but Wahid had escaped. He would not pursue Wahid himself. He left that to the governor. Instead, in concert with the leading priests of Yazd, he took a far more gratifying step. Nicholas reports that after the Nawab confirmed Wahid's departure, he gave a sigh of relief. Besides, he felt that to pursue the fugitives would involve some peril, and that, therefore, it would be infinitely more practical, more beneficial, more profitable, and less dangerous to torture the Babis, or those presumed to be Babis, provided that they were wealthy, who had remained in the city. He sought out the most prosperous, ordered their execution, and confiscated their possessions, avenging thus his outraged religion, a matter of perhaps little concern to him, and filling his coffers, which pleased him immensely. Having failed in their plans to capture and slay Wahid, the authorities had to content themselves with the torture of his servant Hassan. They led him out to a loaded cannon. They thought that they may frighten Hassan into pleading for mercy, and thus force him to renounce his newfound beliefs. After all, he was only a servant. Wahid was a man of great nobility and wisdom, and he might be expected to know what he was doing, but this ignorant servant would certainly save his own life now that his master was gone. If they could make him cry for mercy, they could publicize his recantation. This at least would be one way to humiliate Wahid. The officer gave the command that was calculated to bring Hassan to his knees. He ordered the attendants to bind Hassan with his back to the mouth of the cannon. Hassan entreated them not to do that. "Bind me, I pray you," he pleaded, "with my face towards the gun, that I may see it fired." The gunners and onlookers were astonished at Hassan's composure and cheerfulness. Anyone who can be cheerful in such a plight must have great faith and fortitude. All along the road to Niris, Wahid continued his teaching. Wherever he made camp, his first action was to go immediately to the neighboring village or town. He would gather all the people together. Then he would announce to them the glad tidings of the Bab's appearance. In the mountain village of Bavanat, the leading clergyman of the village, Haji Sayyid Ismail, accepted the faith. Wahid was utterly indifferent to fatigue. In whatever place he succeeded in attracting souls to the faith of the Bab, he would stay the night so that he could deepen their understanding and prepare them to continue the work of teaching after his departure. If none arose to accept or inquire further, he would leave that village at once. "Through whichever village I pass," he often said, "and fail to inhale from its inhabitants the fragrance of belief, its food and its drink are both distasteful to me." When the news of Wahid's approach to Niris spread, there was an exodus from the city to greet him. The governor forbade it, sending a messenger to warn the people that those who persisted would lose their lives, their wives, and their possessions. Not one of the people who had set out heeded this warning. They continued on their way. The governor was dismayed when his messenger reported their disdainful neglect of his warning. he began to fear that those who defied his orders might eventually rise against him. He decided he must take some strong action to protect his position and maintain his prestige. The very first thing Vahid did upon reaching Niris, even before going to his own home, was to enter the place of worship and address the congregation that had gathered there. He called upon them to embrace the faith of the Bab. The promised one of God has appeared, he told them. Still dusty from his journey, Vahid ascended the pulpit and spoke with such convincing eloquence that the whole audience was electrified by his appeal. When the first flush of excitement subsided, Vahid continued speaking. "My sole purpose in coming to Niris," he explained, "is to proclaim the cause of God. I thank and glorify him for having enabled me to touch your hearts with this message." No less than 1,000 persons from his own area and 500 from other sections of Niris spontaneously responded to his appeal and accepted the new faith. "No need for me to tarry any longer in your midst," Vahid told the crowd. He had to leave the city because if he remained any longer, the governor might harm those who had embraced the new faith. The people assured Vahid of their belief, saying, "We are ready and resigned to the will of God. God grant us his grace to withstand the calamities that may yet befall us. We cannot, however, reconcile ourselves to so abrupt and hasty a separation from you." Vahid submitted to their wishes and agreed to stay a few days longer in Niris. At this news, a crowd of men and women gathered around him with cheers and praise, escorted him to the entrance of his house. The governor was terrified to hear that Vahid had won such an avalanche of victories in such an astonishingly short time. The finest citizens from all fields were accepting the faith of the Bab. This number included the governor's own nephew. The governor felt that he must destroy this influence before it undermined his own position with the king and the prime minister. He recruited 1,000 soldiers, both cavalry and infantry. He supplied them with ammunition and ordered them to make a sudden attack on Vahid and bring him back a prisoner. Vahid was informed of the plans for this secret attack. He and his companions followed the pattern of their fellow believers at Sheikh Tabarsi and sought refuge. The prince, who was the governor of Shiraz, joined forces against Vahid and his companions. He gave the same instructions that had been given at Sheikh Tabarsi to exterminate all of the Babis. Vahid and his friends had taken refuge in the fort of Khaja, where they were besieged in the same manner in which Qudus and Mullah Hussein had been besieged in Tabarsi. They were deprived of water and food. Finally, by the same treachery used at Tabarsi, they were betrayed into coming out from their sheltered protection. The governor of Niris, failing time after time to win by force, eventually resorted to deceit, contrary to the pure spirit of Muhammad's teaching. A Quran was sent to Vahid with the following solemn promise. "This Quran, to which we affix our seals, is the witness of the integrity of our purpose. Let that holy book decide whether the claim you advance is true or false. The malediction of God and his prophet rest upon us if we should attempt to deceive you." Vahid received the book with great reverence. "Our appointed hour has struck," he said. "Though I am well aware of their designs, I feel it my duty to accept their call and take the opportunity to attempt once again to unfold the verities of my beloved faith." With 5 companions, Vahid left the fort and entered the governor's camp. For 3 days and 3 nights he spoke to them of the Bab. Though outwardly they appeared to listen and treat him with respect, inwardly they were secretly plotting how they could get the rest of his friends out of the fort so that they could all be destroyed. A plot to persuade Vahid's friends to leave their fort to join Vahid at the camp of the soldiers was conceived and proved successful. This was the beginning of the slaughter. Vahid's companions were seized and arrested the moment they set foot outside the fort. When the news of their capture reached the governor and his staff, they immediately began to take their revenge upon Vahid. They consulted about what would be the best way to evade fulfilling the oath that they had sent with the Quran into the fort. Their scheme was simple. A man, notorious for his ruthlessness and cruelty, volunteered to kill Wahid because he had not taken the oath. He was ready to do what the others felt unable to carry out. "I can arrest at any time," he boasted indignantly, "and put to death whomever I deem guilty of having violated the laws of the land." He summoned all the relatives of those people who had perished in the long struggle to conquer the fort in which Wahid and his friends had been sheltered. He called upon them to carry out the death sentence against Wahid, thus relieving in his own mind both the governor and himself of any responsibility for their deaths. He offered to 3 men in particular the privilege and pleasure of being the first to strike Wahid before turning him over to the mob. He knew that these 3 men would be without mercy. Nariz echoed to the sound of drums and cymbals as Wahid was brought before the people. The eager crowd was held back while the 3 took their turns. The first, Mullah Rida, snatched Wahid's turban from his head, uncoiled it, and then wound it around his neck and dragged him to the ground. Wahid was then tied to a horse. The horse was whipped so that it would drag Wahid through the streets of the city. The second man, Safar, as well as the third man, Aga Khan, struck and beat Wahid at will, and with such ferocity that the onlookers began to worry that there may be no sport left for them. In the midst of his agony, Wahid called out, "Thou knowest, O my beloved, that I have abandoned the world for thy sake, and have placed my trust in thee alone. I am impatient to hasten to thee." The mob fell upon Wahid in a great wave. Their fists and weapons pounded him into insensibility and tore his flesh. Horsemen scattered the crowd so that they could have their turn. Women danced around the corpse, rejoicing to the beat of drums and cymbals. A.L.M. Nicholas, in his history, writes that the multitude, aroused by the scene, stoned and beat to death the unfortunate man. They then severed his head, tore off the skin, stuffed it with straw, and sent that trophy to Shiraz. The frenzied crowd did the same to the heads of Wahid's companions, and sent them as a gift to the prince in Shiraz, who had called for the extermination of Wahid and his friends. These were to be proof to him of the thorough execution of his commands. The prince was feasting when the caravan bearing these awful trophies arrived. It was a festival day in Shiraz, Nicholas recalls. The bazaars were adorned with flags. Joy was general. Suddenly there was absolute silence. They saw coming 32 camels, each carrying an unfortunate prisoner, a woman or a child, bound and thrown crosswise over the saddle like a bundle. All around them were soldiers carrying long lances, and upon each lance was impaled the head of a Bahá'í who had been slain at Nariz. The hideousness of the sight deeply affected the holiday population of Shiraz, and they returned saddened to their dwellings. The horrible caravan passed through the bazaars and continued to the palace of the governor. This personage was in his garden, where he had gathered the rich, eminent citizens of Shiraz. The music ceased, the dancing stopped. Mir Ali Khan stepped toward the prince, bearing his trophies. He told the prince of his own brave deeds in the assault on Wahid and his companions. Mir Ali Khan then named all the prisoners who had been brought, men, women, children. He received congratulations from the prince for his great victory. Special favors were bestowed upon him and his fellow leaders for this gift of severed heads. These events literally fulfilled a well-known Islamic tradition about the coming of the Promised One, which prophesies, "In him shall be the perfection of Moses, the preciousness of Jesus, and the patience of Job. His saints shall be abased in his time, and their heads shall be exchanged as presents. They shall be slain and burned, and shall be afraid, fearful, and dismayed. The earth shall be dyed with their blood, and lamentation and wailing shall prevail among their women. These are my saints indeed." The governor of Niriz was still not satisfied. He hungered for even greater revenge against those who had survived his betrayal. He planned for their annihilation so that none could live to tell the tale of his treachery. Nicholas writes that the governor's hatred knew no bounds, and it was to last as long as he lived. It was actually the very poor that had been sent to Shiraz. The rich had been kept back. The governor had entrusted them to a guard who was ordered to walk them through the city, beating them as they went. The people of Niriz were greatly entertained at that time. The end of Vahid's noble life was the signal for the outbreak of a fierce wave of violence in Niriz that lasted long beyond that day of betrayal. The fort in which Vahid and his friends had sought refuge was burnt to the ground. Their property was seized, their houses destroyed, and many were thrown into dungeons before being subject to a final fiendish torture. The greedy officials made certain that the prisoners had nothing of value left before they were slain. During that black period many were crucified. The fate that befell the betrayers of Tabarsi struck almost at once against one of the most treacherous leaders of the Niriz upheaval. Mir Ali Khan, who had escorted these trophies of severed heads to the prince at Shiraz, whose lips had sung the praises of his own valour, was suddenly struck dumb. He was no longer able to boast of his victorious march with his gruesome prize to the palace of the prince. Mir Ali Khan fell ill shortly after that march. His lips could form words, but no sound would come out. He remained mute and speechless until the very day of his death. On that last day, as he was about to expire, those who stood around him saw from the movement of his lips that he was whispering something. They leaned down to catch his last words, and heard only the sound that had issued from his lips since he had been stricken. 3 times he whispered faintly the words, "Babi, Babi, Babi." Then he fell back dead. It is reported that all of those who were chiefly responsible for these cruelties came to a tragic end and died overwhelmed with calamity. Another great figure among the followers of the Bab had fallen, a man who would later be described by him whom God would make manifest as that unique and peerless figure of his age. The illustrious Vahid, who was known as the most learned, most eloquent, the most influential of the king's subjects, had surrendered all that men hold dear for the privilege of laying down his life in the path of God. The day of Vahid's martyrdom was but 10 days before that of his beloved one, the Bab.